This is how the phosphate bed lays. It starts up here, it comes down towards the Anderson Mine. And we go over towards the Brock Creek and on over towards Warm Spring Creek and off to the south through a series of faults. It swings up and over by the Luke Mine and the Gimlet and on north. And over here we have the Gravely Mine, and out this way is Finn and Avon, and then the highway on down towards the Garrison. This is at the 5400 level at the Anderson Mine. In the center is Mr. Bill Anderson and his boy Bill Jr. And they're showing some rock to a man unknown. George Anderson, son of Bill Anderson, at the Anderson Mine, and he's lived in Helena and been a CPA in Helena for almost 40 years. And he's going to explain what his dad accomplished and things like that. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jack. This is really a rather interesting exercise to have a chance to talk about my father and tell what he did as far as the development of the Garrison phosphate fields. My father was born in Rosalia, Washington, the son of Mattie and George D. Anderson. George D. Anderson had been a grain buyer in the Rosalia area and had also been kind of an amateur prospector. My father therefore became interested in mining, and when he had graduated from high school, he went to the University of California, where he graduated in 1910 with a degree in mining engineering. From there he went to Republic, Washington, where he ran a mine called the Belcher Mine and actually shipped ore to the Consolidated Mining and Smelting Company in Trail, British Columbia, who he was to deal with so closely in the succeeding years. He married my mother, Florence Cheeley, in, I believe, 1912. I'm not too good on remembering these dates. And they had 4 children, my sister Ann and sister Ray, and a brother Bill, and then me. I'm about 6 years younger than my brother Bill, so I was, as my mother always referred to me, the postscript in the family. My father came to Montana in 1914, leaving Washington and selling some property that they had there, and came to Montana and into the Garrison area, where he purchased some land on Brock Creek, between Brock Creek and Warm Springs Creek, from Bill Canoe. And he ranched that until the winter of 1918 and 1919, which many of the people will remember as being one of the toughest winters in Montana. And at that point really lost virtually everything he had. He had always said he paid $100,000 for the ranch when he bought it. And in 1918, 1919, he had it paid for, but went back into debt more than that in order to retain it. About that time, too, he became interested in the phosphate. He had known about the phosphate when he bought the land because of a man named Pardee, who was with the USGS and who did a great deal of work on laying out the geological formations of the Garrison phosphate field. My father became interested in the phosphate and decided that he would like to see if it could possibly be developed. And he traded 100 head of sheep to Bill Canoe for the property that the original Anderson Mine started out on. I believe that was along in 1922 or 23, but I'm, again, not absolutely positive of the dates. But he started prospecting work on the phosphate along about that time, and used to get up early in the morning, get up about 4 o'clock and do all of his chores on the ranch, and then ride a horse or take a wagon and go up to the area on Brock Creek, which was about 7 miles away, and work all day digging pits and the like of that to test the phosphate and see what was there. And then came back about 5 or 6 o'clock that evening and would do all of his chores again. And of course, in those days, why, they did that 7 days a week. He tried to sell the phosphate and did a great deal of work with various people over trying to sell it, but had a very difficult time finding a buyer. One of the interesting ones was when the Anaconda Company decided to build a phosphate plant at Anaconda in order to get rid of their sulfuric acid. There was a man by the name of Garrison that came and talked to him about that he was going to design the fertilizer plant for the Anaconda Company, and that why didn't they use the rock in the Garrison field to design this plant, and that then probably the Anaconda would buy phosphate rock from my father in order to operate that plant. However, what happened was after Mr. Garrison got the plant all designed and thought he was ready to start running it, the Anaconda Company decided to buy phosphate rock out of Idaho, where two of their principals had purchased the mine, and as a consequence why they never used Garrison phosphate in the Anaconda phosphate plant. The Anaconda phosphate plant has now been, of course, disassembled and is all gone. In fact, it was torn down prior to the time that Anaconda really left Montana. It's also interesting that the Garrison who started this, his son started Columbia Paint in Montana, or in Helena, and was very successful. That's been a very successful company. My father attempted to sell rock, and I can remember him talking about trying to sell to the Japanese, trying to sell to various people throughout the world and throughout the country, but he had a very difficult time finding anyone that was really interested in doing it. In about 1928 or 29, however, he made a contact with Consolidated Mining and Smelting, which was the company that he had sold ore from the Belcher mine to, and finally negotiated a contract with them for 100,000 tons of rock at $5 a ton. He didn't have anything. He had no road up to the mine at that time. He really had one small tunnel into the hillside, and that was about all. But he knew that he could get out that 100,000 tons, and he actually did. He produced that 100,000. He didn't quite get 100,000 tons. I believe he produced about 95,000 tons. But when he got done producing it, why, Consolidated Mining said that that was really enough phosphate now to last them for 2 or 3 years, and of course this was just at the start of the Depression, and that as a consequence why they didn't want any more rock. The only problem was that it had cost my father about $600,000 to get out the 500 or the 100,000 tons, and as a consequence he was about 100,000 short. And he had all this equipment, and he had the mine fairly well developed where he could produce more ore, but again he had no place to sell it. He was able to make another contract with Consolidated Mining and Smelting, but that contract was for about $2.50 a ton, as I recall. I don't remember the exact prices now, but it was cut just about in half. Also, it's interesting that about at the time that he did do the Cominco contract and got out the 100,000 tons, why Bill Janey, who was very well known in the area, came to work for my father. And I believe that was sometime in 1929 or 1930. Bill Janey came there mainly to run the trucks, and of course ended up having a contract to haul the phosphate rock until, I believe, sometime in the 1960s before Cominco actually canceled that contract. During the Depression, and I would guess that it was along about 1933, why they closed up the mine completely. There was no one was buying fertilizer, and as a consequence why Cominco decided to close their fertilizer plant, and as a consequence why they did close the phosphate mine. And I believe it was in 1933 or 4, and I believe they reopened it then again in about 1936 or 37. During that period of time, my father had a placer mine down in the 9 Mile and near Missoula, and also had a gold mine in California, an underground gold mine in California. Bill Janey actually worked with him on both of those particular projects at the time too. But in 1936 he came back and he reopened the phosphate mine, and I believe about that time they formed Montana Phosphate Products Company, which was owned 50% by my father and 50% by Consolidated Mining and Smelting, as it was known as at that particular time. The problem was my father really did not have the wherewithal and the necessary capital to keep up all the money that had to be spent for development work and the like of that. And as a consequence, really Consolidated Mining pretty well controlled Montana Phosphate Products and what he was able to do. In about 1938 or 39, my father became interested in the Gravely mine. And the Gravely mine, which is outside of Avon, was started by Charlie Gravely. He had done some development work on it and done some prospecting work on it, had a little tunnel driven in. And my father became interested in it because it was good high-grade phosphate. So he dealt with Charlie Gravely trying to work out some kind of an agreement between he and Charlie as to mining that particular rock and also selling it to Consolidated Mining and Smelting. I recall one trip that I made up to see Charlie Gravely with my father, and I believe I was a senior in high school, and so it would have been probably in late 39, or it may have been in early 1940. And we showed up about 11:30, and Charlie and his wife were still at church, and as a consequence we waited around. In fact, I believe we walked up to where the mine is and looked around there. That was the first time I'd been up to see it. And came back, and then when Charlie and Rhoda Gravely came back, why we chatted with them, or my father chatted with Charlie about possibly trying to make a deal on the phosphate. And it was always kind of interesting to me. We sat in the front room, and Rhoda sat in the kitchen. But when it got down to where my father actually made some kind of an offer on the phosphate, why Charlie got up to where he could see Rhoda and see what she said, and she shook her head no, and that was the end of the negotiations for that day. But eventually they did make a deal, and as everyone knows, why Charlie Gravely collected a good deal of royalties out of the phosphate that was produced. He had the guts to hang on to it and to work with it, and figured that it was going to be worth something someday, and as a consequence, why he came out making some money on it, and to me I think that was a good thing. My father then operated both of those mines from 1940 to 1944, and in 1944 he sold out completely to Consolidated Mining and Smelting. He had in the meantime, taken over the Luke mine, as I recall. I believe it was taken over right in the latter part of 1943 or 44, and so that they were operating all of the mines at that time. I believe he decided to sell out. My brother and I had gone to the service. I think he felt that it was too tough a deal to try and operate the way that he had been operating, and that as a consequence, why he would sell it out and get out of it before we came back and decided that we should go on into it. One thing I should go back and tell about was my father had, as I said, acquired the land where the original Anderson mine is back in the early 20s. And then he had acquired some government leases, and as a consequence, he was not able to have any more government leases in his name. There was then a lease called the Janey lease that was taken at what is now called, well, it's where the old shaft was, and where what we always referred to as the 5200. And that lease was taken in Bill Janey's name and was always called the Janey lease. Another interesting thing that happened with my father during the time that he was developing the phosphate was a fellow by the name of Harry Wells came there and was working for another company. It seems to me the company's name was Lake Watton Company, but I'm not absolutely sure. But I remember Harry and Vita Wells staying at our house down at the old ranch, and he and Dad working on the phosphate. Harry was a mining man. I don't know whether he had a mining engineering degree. I think he possibly did. But again, there was some phosphate rock they found up in the area between Brock Creek and Warm Springs Creek, and decided they should take a lease on it. But again, my father couldn't take the lease, so the lease was taken in Harry Wells' name. Harry Wells was later shot by a prospector down in Idaho when the prospector thought that Harry was trying to jump some of his claims. And as a consequence, Harry's wife Vida inherited the phosphate lease that was up between Brock Creek and Warm Springs Creek. After the war, after the 1945-46, when my brother and I came back into Montana, we attempted to make a deal with Vida Wells to see if we could get that phosphate. But she decided that she wanted to have her brother-in-law develop that, and that brother-in-law was George Relier. And so George came up there and developed the Relier mine, which I believe started in about 1947 or 1948. It may have been a little bit later. Also, my brother and I and my father did some work on a property down at Maiden Rock, Montana, that we developed a phosphate mine down there. However, the rock as such would not run to grade. We were not able to ship it to someone such as Consolidated Mining or to anyone that was making fertilizer. But we did develop the mine and then later sold it to Victor Chemical Company, who make elemental phosphorus, were making elemental phosphorus at Silver Bow. They later sold out to Stauffer Chemical Company. We also, my brother and I also did some work on the Warm Springs mine where Chemical American is located now. We shipped a test shipment out of the west side of the gulch, but the trouble was that apparently the warm water in the Warm Springs Creek had affected that particular rock, and the rock would not run to grade. And as a consequence, we did not have the capital to go ahead and develop it. Possibly if we had started in on the east side of the creek instead of on the west side, we would have hit the vein that Chemical now operates on over there, and might still be in the phosphate business. However, my wife has been very happy that happened, and she feels that she likes the CPA business a lot more than she liked the mining business at the time we were in it. I've been very happy to have a chance to talk about my father. He was quite well known in the Deer Lodge and Garrison area. He was quite a promoter, as anyone that might still remember him would well know. He was a very capable mining engineer, did a tremendous job as far as developing the Garrison phosphate field. He worked out most of the mining problems and as to how they would operate, and really those mining plans are still being followed in that particular field and have been followed all those years. He was an absolute incurable optimist. He always knew he was a typical miner. He always knew that after the next round, there'd be a pot of gold there, and was always looking for another mine of some type. He had worked in the Coeur d'Alenes as a boy and was always looking for a mine in the Coeur d'Alenes, and looked at many properties there and did some work on lots of properties, but never really found anything. He was very good to his family. I always recall that when I went to school, and it was really during the latter part of the Depression, and when I went to college, there was no requirement that I work. If I wanted to work, I could do so, but he said, don't worry about it. I'll see that your education is financed and you don't have to worry about it. And he was always good about sending me a little extra money now and then, and it was always appreciated. He was an exceptionally bright man and a very well-read man. I think many people may know that he had a little habit of drinking, and a couple of old friends of his, Bill Janey and Bill Knope, used to kind of lead him astray, or he led them astray now and then. And I really think they supported the old Bensick bar down Garrison and then the one up in Avon. I think they really kind of helped support it for a few years. But he was in the phosphate business probably about 10 or 20 years ahead of his time. Had the phosphate business developed to where it had developed, let's say, in the 1950s and 1960s, if he had then started those mines then, why, it probably would have been a completely different story as to how he came out on them. But he was a man that had a great deal of foresight and knew that those particular mines would develop into something great over the period of years. I'm not sure how much rock has been taken out of the mines and over the lifetime, but it has to be a considerable amount. Possibly Jack, in finishing up this particular thing, will find out how much has been produced and so forth.